Well, let's dive into our text now. And we're going to be looking at verses 15 through 18. And we're going to break this up into two sections. We're going to look at verses 15, 16, and then look at verses 17 and 18. And as Paul begins, let me go ahead and read verse 15 and 16. He says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him." And as we open up here, we begin to see that Paul's now going to explain, if you will, the position of Christ, who he is. And he first off says, let me explain to you his relationship to all of creation, the physical world and everything in it or not in it, and that you can see or not see. I want you to understand his relationship there. So you can begin with that before we go to other relationships of what he's done with humanity, etc. So let me explain that to begin with. So he says, he is the image of the invisible God. In other words, Christ visibly represented the character of God, who is invisible. You can't see him. He's spirit. But Christ is the one who he has explained him. So he is the one who's explained who God is. And that particular word for image is a Greek word which was used in particular of taking a coin, and they would, put the silver or gold, whatever it was, and they would take the stamp, if you will. They would put it in the mint, if you will, put it on the anvil, and they'd go whack, and then they would create that image, or statues, or other things like that. But this word was associated with the coins. And so in those days, we are kind of like this, but we're not really like this. When they saw that image, that was the representation of the real thing. When they saw that, oh, that's the emperor. Because, today, how many different ways? Hey, I want to look up Bill Smith. How many Bill Smith pictures can I find? Boom. Oh, those are all Bill Smiths. We can find out all sorts of information. If Julius Caesar walked into the room, would they know who he was? Well, unless they'd seen him, who's this guy? He could be any kind of person at all. But when you saw the stamp, that's Julius Caesar. That's Caesar, Tiberius Caesar. That's, whoever. And in their world, that represented reality, far more so than it does in our world. So when Paul says he is the image of the invisible God, he's saying this is exact representation. This is who God is. So you begin with saying, well, he's God. He represents, he is God. And in their minds, that's the equation that they would have. They would link those two ideas together. And because you can't see God, but Christ shows you who God is. Kind of exciting when you start thinking about it. But for a Gnostic, you're like, that would be kind of tough to deal with, because we don't believe in a deity that is, or a spiritual being that is material is good. And again, proto-Gnosticism may be a part of this thing, but they wouldn't like this. And later on, these issues are going to come up in the church under Marcion. To a Jew, they just heard Paul say, he's God. Well, if you're trying to convince the Colossians as a Jewish argument, saying, well, yes, he may have done this, but he's not God. He can't be God. We're monotheistic. There's no way this is possible. And we'll talk about this more as we go through here. Paul's saying, yeah, he is. He's the exact representation. He is the exact showing of who God is, because he is God. Pretty tough stuff to deal with these guys. And the whole notion that we have a challenge with even in our own day, Trinitarian doctrine, the Father, the Son, the Spirit, one God, three persons, or one being, three persons. That doctrine took several hundred years to piece together. And if you really look into the Old Testament, unless you're like reading backwards into, that passage must have meant this, that passage must have meant that, you're going to have a real hard time, especially in Paul's time, going up with, hey, here's the Trinitarian argument from the Old Testament. And these Jews are going to be arguing this stuff, and Paul's going, no, this is who he is. This is who Christ is. He is an exact representation. That's kind of mind-blowing. It's hard to deal with, even in our day. But we're not doing a lesson on the Trinity, so that's a whole nother class. The next thing in second part of this verse, he says that he is the firstborn of all creation. Now, that idea of being firstborn could be better understood that he is over it all. He is the one who has the authority and the position of the heir, not that he was the first created being. That's a heresy that was later on in the church under Arius. That Christ was the first being created, but he's not really fully God. So Paul says, no. I want you to understand he's the firstborn of all creation. And if we put ourselves in the context of what's going on with the people in Colossae and in Jews in particular, what are some of the things that a firstborn? Tell me what are some of the things that a firstborn in their mind and their culture would be? Okay, yeah, he would be an inheritor. He gets it. Double portion, right? He would get a double portion of honor. There would be more to the firstborn. And so when you think about it from being thought of as the firstborn of creation, he is over it. So the firstborn was the one in their culture. Again, we're just doing a comparison here, not the absolute. But in their culture, the firstborn was the one who carries on the family name. They're the leader of the family. They're the one of most importance. They get the greatest portion of the inheritance. They have all of these benefits and all of these advantages, and they're the first. The family, if they're going to make a decision after dad's gone, they make the decisions. So when all of these different positions, Paul says he's the image of the invisible God. In other words, he's God. And the firstborn of creation, you're like, oh, okay, so he is the heir. He is the one in charge. He is the one who has authority. He is the one who has all these things. So that idea of firstborn is a lot more than just, okay, he was born first, or there was some physical birth type of an idea. Because it's talking about the position of being firstborn, or, if you will, over the creation. And if we combine this with some of the previous statements, the notion that, again, a Gnostic might held that, Christ was some kind of created spiritual being, but not divine, this would be dealing with that. And again, proto-Gnosticism, but later on we definitely know that comes into place. Now, the other thing that's interesting is for a Jew, we've talked about some of the ideas that a Jew might think about what a firstborn was, but this particular phrase that Paul is pulling out would go back to Psalm 89, verse 27, in which God is speaking of the reigning king at the time. He says, I also shall make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. And so the idea of being firstborn of creation, not only is he representative of God, he's the firstborn over all creation. This would be saying he is the king and he is the ruler. And he is the King of Kings. And where do we see those types of phrases? Both in the Old Testament, New Testament, and particularly Revelation. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's the highest one. So the firstborn idea here carries a whole lot more meaning than this flat, okay, he was created first, born first type of situation. So Christ's position is right off the bat saying, this is the Creator. This is God. This is the one who's in charge of everything. He is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. You could stop right there, but Paul doesn't. He's going to continue to expand upon that. And when we get to verse 16 now, he says, for by him. So he's now giving a reason, or why is he this? He says, for by him all things were created. Now we can again stop there. He's using the idea of all things, and that was a common philosophical term, or in philosophy of that time, that saying it's all of everything, of every type. And if you were wondering, well, let me explain to you what that all things means. And now Paul goes on and he says, okay, first off, it's both in heavens and on earth, in the heavens and on earth. And so everything that you know about, everything that you can see, everything that is understandable at that time, and we understand a whole lot more than they did, he's the creator of it. He's the one who has authority. He's the firstborn over it. He has rule over it, so to speak. So he has that. And then he goes on, he says, and whether visible or invisible. Well, at that particular time, they would go, wow, whether I can see it or not, because they couldn't see the heavens, they couldn't see a lot of stuff. Look at our day. Oh, look, there's atoms and quarks and electrons and, all these other kinds of things, and stars and galaxies we can see. Well, gosh, is he creator of all that? Well, they couldn't see it. He says, yeah, whether it's visible or not, whether they understand it or not, whether you see it or not, he is the creator of it. So heavens and earth, all that you know, visible or invisible, whether you can see it, know it, understand it, recognize it or not. And then whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authority. In other words, it does not matter what kind of power or authority they have. So he's over all of those things. So it goes right back. Firstborn, he's the highest King of kings. So it doesn't matter whether spiritual realm or the earthly realm, whatever, he is the one who is over all of that too. So Paul's pretty much covering his bases, whether it's a physical thing, whether you can see it or not, and it doesn't matter what role it has, what kind of power would be dealt with. And you can imagine in the people in these particular days, well, what other things would they might think of power? Yeah, other gods. Yeah, there's all sorts of other gods. And so even in here, Paul's saying, it doesn't matter if you think there's other gods. You can believe that all you want to. He's still over that. So these gods are not of the power that you think they are. And of course, there aren't any. But even in the secular theological thinking outside of the scriptures, he would say Christ is still over all that. So whatever God you think you have, he's under Christ. Now, he continues on here in this end phrase in verse 16. He says, all things have been created through him and for him. And let's just take just a second to sort of look at those ideas. First off, that phrase there about that he is, all things have been created through him, harkens back again to some of those Genesis ideas. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And here we're getting the same sense that he is the one who created, and all these things that come into play are through him. And in the Greek, this is a perfect passive indicative, which points to the result of a creation. And so all things have been created through him. In other words, all that you see, all of the results came through him. It would be almost like he's the means, he's the conduit, he's the funnel, he is the reason why it's all there. And therefore, as you can see, in all of the earthly realms, all of the power realms, all of the heavenly realms, all of the created realms that we think in terms of creation, he is the central focus of it. And so a lot of times we talk about Christocentric, and we're going to expand on that in a second. But the thing that's interesting is he's also going to be talking about that all things hold together for him, and we'll look at that in the next section. But Paul finishes off and it says, though they were created through him, they were also created for him. And as much as we like to think, the universe was created and mankind was put here and we are the central beings and all this other kind of stuff, that's not true. We have an important role. We have an important dynamic and aspect in the creation. And God has given us great privilege and right and to be in his image and all these other things, but it's still not for us. And a lot of times we forget everything around us is not for us, it's for him. And we know ultimately Christ is going to have power and authority over everything, and all of the enemies will be put under his feet, no matter what they are. Everything will be dealt with. And then ultimately Christ, we are his inheritance, and yet we're joint heirs with him. There's all sorts of dynamics that go along with this. It's all for him. And then ultimately he says, and I will now give that back to the Father. Because it was his plan, it was his purposes, and ultimately it's still for me, because this is the interaction that we will eventually have in eternity, because we get to be with Jesus. See, that's why he had to become a God-man. Again, we're not going to go off on that. But all of it's for him. And everything we do is for Him. Why are we supposed to walk in a manner worthy of Him? Because it's for Him. What we're doing is for Him. Why are we on this planet? It's for Him. Why are we in the situation we're in? It's for Him. So no matter where we look at in our life, Paul keeps coming back. He says He made it, and it's all for Him. No matter what is going on. And we're going to see how that flushes out in the next section. But let me bring one more idea into play here. And this is, if it's this is for free kind of a thing. If we really think about, things being Christ-centered or Christocentric, and that's not a bad term or anything like that, but we have to be careful with it and when we start applying it and when we're interpreting Scripture. It's very easy to take ideas in the New Testament and say, oh, it points to Christ, and then, well, that means I got to find those same things in the Old Testament. Well, that hermeneutic, that approach to Christocentricity can get us into trouble with, well, maybe that has really nothing to do with what was being taught here, because that past was pointing to a future. And I like a term a little bit better, as I call it. I've read this elsewhere, so it's not my idea. Is Christotelic. In other words, it's all's finished. It's brought to completion. It's consummated in Christ. And we see this idea in Revelation when He says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega." And right here, He is the creator of all things. He's the sustainer of all things, we're going to see in a second, but it's all for Him. So everything is landing on, completed and consummated in Him. So it is Christocentric, but from a hermeneutical perspective, if we think of it as Christotelic, we start saying the law was a tutor. To do what? Lead us to here. Click, 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 click. Forward. So all of it's pointing forward in progressive revelation and progressive revelation of God's plans, His purposes, etc., and it all is consummated in Him. So yes, in a sense, that's Christocentric, but that can mess up the way we attack the Scriptures when we're looking at it. If we just start going, well, let's start grabbing all these verses in the Old Testament because I see these things in the New Testament, we will miss what was actually being said then, because that's all those people would understand. Yes, it is going to point forward, but we don't read back over it. So again, Christocentric is great, but Christotelic, I think, maybe is better, at least when we're dealing with how to handle Scripture. So we're going to look in our next section, we're going to pick up and complete this with verses 17 and 18.